My daughter-in-law brought a city inspector to my house to force me to pave over my garden. She called my native plants a fire hazard and an eyesore that ruined the neighborhood's value. She didn't know that the man she hired to destroy my yard was about to declare it a priceless national treasure. The mid-morning sun in Carlsbad felt heavy on my shoulders, but it was a good kind of weight. It was the feeling of life, of heat that woke up the sleeping earth. I knelt on my foam pad, my knees cracking just a little, and dug my fingers into the dry, sandy soil. To anyone driving past in their air-conditioned sedans, my front yard probably looked like a mistake. It was brown, gray, and muted green. It did not look like the emerald carpets of grass that rolled out in front of every other house on the street. I brushed a layer of dust off a twisting branch of manzanita. Its bark was smooth and red, peeling back in thin, papery strips. It looked ancient and stubborn just like me. "Drink up," I whispered to it. I poured a measured cup of water at its base. My garden was not dead. It was simply resting. This was the coastal sage scrub, the native skin of California before the sprinklers and the imported turf took over. I inhaled deeply. The scent was strong, a mix of sharp sage, sun-baked dust, and the sweet resinous smell of the chaparral. It was the smell of home. A large silver SUV turned onto my driveway. The engine purred so quietly it was almost silent, but the tires crunched loudly over the loose gravel I used instead of pavement. I sighed and wiped my dirty hands on my canvas trousers. My son Mark stepped out first. He looked tired. He wore a polo shirt that was tucked in too tight, and he checked his phone before he even looked at me. Then the passenger door opened. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, emerged. She did not look tired. She looked ready for battle. She wore pristine white sneakers that had clearly never touched a garden spade. Her sunglasses were big and dark, hiding her eyes, but I could see the tight line of her mouth. "Hi, Mom," Mark said. He walked over and gave me a quick one-armed hug. He smelled like car air freshener and coffee. "Hello, Mark," I said. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees. "Jessica." "Alara," Jessica said. She didn't hug me. She stood by the hood of the car and surveyed the yard. Her head tilted to the side. "It's certainly dry out here today." "It's summer in Southern California," I said calmly. "It's supposed to be dry." Jessica walked onto the path. I had lined it with river stones, but she stepped carefully, as if she were afraid of catching a disease from the ground. She stopped in front of a large patch of California buckwheat. The flowers were rust-colored now, dried out and stiff. "Mark, look at this," Jessica said, pointing a manicured finger at the bush. "This is what the HOA president was talking about. It looks like a fire hazard." "It's dormant," I explained, stepping between her and the plant. "It holds the soil together. If we get a heavy rain, this plant stops the mud from sliding into the street." Jessica lowered her sunglasses. Her eyes were cold. "If it rains, Alara. It hasn't rained in months. Right now it just looks like a pile of dead twigs." Mark shifted his weight. "Jess, maybe let's just go inside? Mom probably has lemonade." "I have iced tea," I said. "Made with mint from the backyard." Jessica ignored the offer. She turned a full circle, scanning the perimeter of my property. To my left, the neighbor's lawn was a vibrant, artificial green. It was astroturf. It smelled like hot plastic in the summer and required vacuuming. To my right, the Smiths had a lawn that required daily watering, a lush expanse that sucked up expensive resources. My yard sat between them like a wild, untamed island. "We aren't here just for tea, Alara," Jessica said. Her voice dropped to that tone people use when talking to toddlers or the very hard of hearing. "We're worried about you." "I'm fine," I said. I picked up my trowel. "My checkup last month was perfect. My blood pressure is lower than Mark's." "Not your health," Jessica said. She gestured vaguely at the house, at the yard, at me. "Your capacity. This place is a lot of work. We drove by last week and saw you hauling bags of mulch. At your age, that's dangerous." "It's exercise," I said. "It's a nuisance," Jessica countered. She took a step closer. "The neighbors are talking, Alara. They say the property values are dipping because of the abandoned lot look. That's what they call it. Abandoned." I felt a flash of heat in my chest, hotter than the sun on my back. This land is not abandoned. It is the most alive plot on this street. There are lizards in those rocks. There are native bees in the sage. Bees, Jessica repeated, wrinkling her nose. Great. More liabilities. Mark finally spoke up. Mom, look, we just want you to be comfortable. You shouldn't have to be on your knees in the dirt every day. I like being on my knees in the dirt, I said firmly. It keeps me moving. Jessica crossed her arms. Well, it's becoming a problem for us. We are the ones who have to hear the complaints at the block parties. We are the ones who have to worry if you fall, and no one finds you for days behind a bush. She opened her purse and pulled out a folded brochure. It was glossy and bright. On the cover was a picture of a house with a smooth, gray concrete driveway that extended across the entire front yard, dotted with 3 identical potted succulents. Low maintenance, Jessica said, tapping the photo. Clean, modern, and safe. No dirt, no bugs, no weeds. I looked at the picture. It looked like a parking lot. It looked dead. I am not paving my garden, I said. My voice was steady, but my hands gripped the trowel tight. Just think about it, Jessica said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. For the family. For Mark. She placed the brochure on the flat rock I used as a side table. It sat there, shiny and fake against the rough, honest stone. 3 days later, the mailbox made a loud metal squeak when I pulled the door down. Inside, there was the usual stack of grocery coupons and a bill for the water, but underneath those lay a thick, white envelope. The return address in the upper left corner belonged to the City of Carlsbad Code Enforcement Division. I stood at the end of my driveway. The concrete felt hard through the soles of my gardening clogs. I slid my finger under the flap of the envelope and ripped it open. The paper inside was heavy. Notice of public nuisance, the bold text read. I scanned the lines below. Complaint received regarding overgrown vegetation, fire hazard, and unsightly premises. It cited a city ordinance number. At the bottom, a date for compliance was stamped in red ink, 30 days. I lowered the paper. The wind blew a few dried leaves across my boots. I looked at my yard. To my left, a cluster of Madeleine poppies stood 6 feet tall. Their white petals, as thin and wrinkled as crepe paper, fluttered in the breeze. In the center of each flower, a ball of yellow pollen shook slightly. A hummingbird zipped past my ear, its wings making a low thrumming sound, and hovered near the red tubular flowers of the wild fuchsia. It was not a nuisance. It was a habitat. Across the street, a garage door opened with a mechanical groan. Mr. Henderson backed his sedan out of the driveway. He rolled down his window as he reached the street. He was a man of few words, usually just a nod or a wave, but today he stopped the car completely. "Morning, Alara," he called out. He didn't look at me directly. He looked at the steering wheel. "Good morning, Bill," I said. I held the letter against my chest. He cleared his throat. "I wanted to tell you. Your daughter-in-law came by yesterday evening." My stomach tightened. "Did she?" "Yeah. She had a clipboard," Bill said. He finally looked at me. His face was red. "She said you were having trouble keeping up with things. Said she was trying to get a petition going to help you get a variance for some landscaping work. To make it easier for you." I gripped the letter harder. The sharp edge of the paper dug into my thumb. "She said she wants to help me?" "That's what she said," Bill nodded. "She said if enough neighbors signed, the city would expedite the permits to pave the front. She made it sound like you agreed to it, but needed the paperwork pushed through." "I see," I said. My voice was flat. "I signed it, Alara." "I thought I was helping," Bill said. He shifted the car into drive. "But now seeing you standing there, you don't look like you need help." "I don't," I said. He nodded once, looked guilty, and drove away. The sound of his engine faded down the street. I walked back up the stone path to my porch. I sat on the wooden bench I had built myself 20 years ago. I placed the city notice on the small table next to my cold cup of coffee. Jessica was not just complaining anymore. She was constructing a narrative. She was telling the neighborhood that I was a frail, confused old woman who couldn't manage her own property. She was using their pity to destroy my work. I stood up and walked to the side of the house where the hose reel hung. I unwound the green rubber tubing and dragged it to the driest patch of the garden, a section of dormant sagebrush. I turned the nozzle to a gentle mist. The water hissed as it hit the dry earth. The smell of wet dust rose up immediately, sharp and clean. A white sedan with the city seal on the door rolled slowly past my house. The driver slowed down. He didn't stop, but I saw his head turn. He was looking at the yard. He was taking notes on a pad attached to his dashboard. I didn't wave. I just kept watering. That evening, the phone in the kitchen rang. I knew who it was before I picked it up. "Did you get the mail, Alara?" Jessica's voice was bright, too loud for the small receiver. "I got the notice," I said. I leaned against the kitchen counter. The granite felt cool against my lower back. "Oh good," she said. "I told Mark we should check on you. It's scary getting official letters like that. The fines can be thousands of dollars, you know, per day." "I know how to read, Jessica. We just don't want you to lose your savings over some stubborn pride," she continued. I spoke to the contractor again. He has an opening next week. If we show the city a signed contract for the paving, they'll drop the violation immediately. I can bring the papers over tomorrow. I looked out the kitchen window. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the yard. The shapes of the bushes looked like sleeping animals. "No," I said. "Alara, be reasonable. The whole street agrees. I have 20 signatures." "You lied to them," I said. "You told them I wanted this." "I told them what was necessary," Jessica said. Her voice lost its brightness. It became hard and flat. "You are one bad fall away from a nursing home, Alara. And that yard is a liability. If you won't make the right choice, we have to make it for you." "Do not come over tomorrow," I said. I hung up the phone. The plastic clicked loudly into the base. The kitchen was silent. The refrigerator hummed in the corner. I made a cup of herbal tea and went out to the back porch. The air was cooling down. Crickets chirped in the tall grass near the fence. I sat in the dark, holding the warm ceramic mug with both hands. I could feel the heat seeping into my palms. They saw dirt. They saw mess. They saw a problem to be paved over and painted gray. I took a sip of the tea. It tasted like chamomile and earth. I wasn't just fighting for plants. I was fighting for my right to exist in this space without being managed, polished, or erased. I closed my eyes and listened to the wind rattle the dry leaves of the corn plant. It sounded like a whisper, telling me to stay put. The morning of the deadline was gray and overcast. A marine layer hung low over the coast, muffling the sounds of the neighborhood. The air felt damp and sticky on my skin. I was in the front yard pulling invasive mustard weeds. They came up easily in the damp soil, their roots pale and spindly. I tossed them into a green waste bin. My hands were covered in dirt, and there was a smear of mud on the knee of my jeans. A black luxury car pulled up to the curb. Jessica got out. She wore a sharp gray blazer and black heels that clicked loudly on the asphalt. She didn't look at me. She walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. A man stepped out. He wore a high-visibility vest over a white button-down shirt. He held a thick clipboard and a digital camera. A lanyard with a city ID card hung around his neck. They walked up the driveway together. Jessica pointed at the manzanita bush, then swept her hand across the expanse of the yard. She said something I couldn't hear, but the man nodded and wrote on his clipboard. I stood up and wiped my hands on my pants. I stayed near the porch. "Alara," Jessica called out as they approached. Her voice was loud, performative. "This is Inspector Davis from the city. I told him you were expecting us." Inspector Davis looked at me. He had a tired face and thick glasses. He didn't smile. "Ma'am, we've had multiple reports of code violations. Overgrowth, potential fire hazards, lack of maintenance." "It is maintained," I said. "It is native landscaping." Davis looked around. He stepped off the driveway and onto the dirt path. He kicked a small pile of dried leaves with his boot. "The code requires vegetation to be kept trimmed and green. This material is largely dry. It presents a combustible fuel load." "It's dormant," I repeated. "It's how these plants survive the summer." "It looks like kindling to me," Davis said. He raised his camera and snapped a photo of the brown buckwheat. The shutter clicked loudly. Jessica stood behind him, arms crossed. A small, satisfied smile played on her lips. "See? I told you, Alara. It's dangerous. We just want to make it safe. The contractor can start demolition on Monday." Davis walked deeper into the yard. He pushed aside a branch of lemonade berry. He stopped in front of a low, sprawling patch of succulents near the center of the garden. These were small, chalky white plants that grew in tight rosettes. They looked like stones covered in powder. He frowned. He leaned down, squinting behind his glasses. He didn't take a picture. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a phone. "What's wrong?" Jessica asked. She took a step forward, her heels sinking slightly into the loose soil. "Is it an infestation?" "That would explain the smell." Davis ignored her. He held his phone up to the plants, snapping several close-up photos. He typed something on the screen, waited, and then typed again. He looked up at the house, then back at the plants. "Ma'am," Davis said to me, "did you plant these?" "Some of them," I said. "Some were here when we bought the house 40 years ago. They were under the ivy the previous owners planted. I just cleared the space for them." Davis stood up slowly. He looked different now. The boredom was gone from his face, replaced by a sharp, nervous energy. He tapped his clipboard with a pen. "I need to make a call," he said. "A call to who?" Jessica asked, checking her watch. "We have the demolition permit application right here. We just need your signature to approve the remediation." "I can't sign off on anything right now," Davis said. He was already dialing. He turned his back to us and walked toward the street. "Yeah, dispatch? This is Davis. I need a specialist at the Walnut Avenue site." "Yeah. Code 424. Possible biological clearance issue." Jessica looked at me confused. "Biological clearance? Is that toxic mold? Did you put something toxic in the ground, Alara?" "I put nothing in the ground but water," I said. Davis walked back to us. He put his phone away. "A specialist is coming. Dr. Finch. He's a botanist with the County Conservation District. He handles specific cases." "A botanist?" Jessica laughed, a short, sharp sound. "We don't need a botanist to tell us these are weeds. Just write the citation so we can get to work." "I can't do that," Davis said. He stood with his feet apart, blocking the path to the street. "If these are what I think they are, nobody touches this ground until Finch says so. It's protocol." We stood in silence. The marine layer was burning off, and the sun began to break through the clouds. The light hit the chalky white leaves of the succulents, making them glow faintly against the dark soil. Jessica tapped her foot. "This is ridiculous. It's a stall tactic." 10 minutes later, a battered green truck rattled up the street. It had mud on the tires and a bumper sticker that read, "I brake for lichen." It parked crookedly behind Jessica's pristine luxury car. The door opened with a creak. A tall man unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He wore cargo shorts, hiking boots, and a t-shirt with a diagram of a root system on it. He had a beard that looked like a bird's nest and carried a canvas satchel. "Dr. Finch," Davis called out. Dr. Finch didn't wave. He walked straight past Jessica without looking at her. He walked past Davis. He walked right up to the patch of white succulents and dropped to his knees in the dirt. He pulled a magnifying loupe from his pocket and put it to his eye. He leaned in until his nose almost touched the leaves. Jessica scoffed. "Unbelievable." Finch stayed frozen for a long moment. Then he sat back on his heels. He took a deep breath and looked up at me. His eyes were wide and bright blue. "Do you know what you have here?" he asked. His voice was quiet, reverent. "Succulents," Jessica said loudly from the driveway. "Ugly ones." Finch turned his head slowly to look at her. "Be quiet," he said. It wasn't rude. It was just a command, like telling a dog to sit. He turned back to me. He reached out and hovered his hand over the plant, not touching it. "This is Dudleya veritii," he said. "Verities live forever. It is critically endangered. It only grows on specific volcanic soils in this county. There are fewer than 2,000 individual plants left in the entire world." He looked around the garden, really looking at it for the first time. He saw the manzanita. He saw the scrub oak. "This isn't a garden," Finch said. He stood up and dusted off his knees. He looked at Davis. "This is a remnant population. It's a genetic bank." Jessica walked up to him. Her face was red. "I don't care if it's rare. It's on private property. We are paving it." Finch laughed. It was a dry, raspy sound. No, he said. You definitely are not. Dr. Finch did not stand up immediately. He opened his canvas satchel and pulled out a roll of bright orange flagging tape. He tore off a strip and tied it gently around a dry twig near the white succulents. The plastic crinkled loudly in the quiet yard. What are you doing? Jessica demanded. She stepped onto the dirt, her heels sinking deeper. You can't just decorate my mother-in-law's yard with trash. Finch ignored her. He stood up and walked to the next patch of brush. He tied another ribbon. Then he walked to the property line, where the wild buckwheat met the neighbor's astroturf. He tied a third ribbon to a wooden stake he pulled from his bag and hammered it into the ground with the heel of his boot. Inspector Davis, Finch said, not looking up. I need the GPS unit. We have to map the perimeter of the population. Davis hurried to his car. He came back with a yellow handheld device that beeped rhythmically. Jessica grabbed Davis's arm. Excuse me. I'm speaking to you. We have a contractor coming in 3 days. We paid a deposit. You are going to tell this gardener to leave. Davis gently removed her hand from his arm. He looked serious. Ma'am, you don't understand. This isn't a code violation anymore. This is a federal jurisdiction issue now. Jessica blinked. Her mouth opened but no sound came out. Finch walked over to us. He smelled like sweat and sage. He pointed a dirty finger at the white plants. That is a federally listed species. Under the Endangered Species Act, it is illegal to remove, damage, or destroy it. It is also illegal to alter the habitat that supports it. It's a front yard, Jessica spat. It's not a habitat. It's a suburban lot in Carlsbad. Nature doesn't care about your zoning maps, Finch said. He took the GPS unit from Davis. This soil is unique. It's a clay lens that runs under this specific hill. The plant has probably been here for thousands of years. Long before this house. Long before the road. He turned to me. His blue eyes were serious. Alara, did you transplant these from the wild? No, I said. I told you. They were here. I just stopped mowing them. Finch nodded. Good. That means this is an existing, viable population. It makes the protection absolute. Jessica pulled her phone out. Her hands shook slightly. I'm calling Mark. I'm calling our lawyer. This is ridiculous. You are claiming my mother-in-law's house is a national park. Not the house, Finch corrected. Just the land. You can't pave it. You can't pour concrete over it. You can't even put down astroturf. The runoff chemicals would kill the soil chemistry. Jessica dialed a number and pressed the phone to her ear. She turned her back to us, pacing near the driveway. Mark? Mark, you need to come here. Now. The city is insane. They are saying we can't pave. I watched her pace. She kicked at a loose stone, scuffing the toe of her black leather shoe. Davis took a clipboard from his car. He pulled out a form with a red border. He began to write. Alara, I'm going to have to issue a temporary administrative hold on the property. It just means no construction permits can be issued until Dr. Finch finishes his survey. That's fine, I said. It also means, Davis added, glancing at Jessica, that if anyone disturbs these plants, the fines start at $50,000 per plant. Jessica froze. She lowered the phone. What did you say? 50,000, Davis repeated. Civil and criminal penalties apply. Jessica looked at the patch of white succulents. There were dozens of them. She looked at the large manzanita. She looked at me. Her face was pale beneath her makeup. Mark, she said into the phone, her voice a whisper. Don't come. Just stay at work. She hung up. She looked at the brochure for the concrete paving that was still sitting on my porch table from days ago. The wind caught it and blew it onto the ground. Finch finished marking the perimeter. The yard was now dotted with bright orange flags. It looked like a construction site, but one where the goal was to build nothing. I need to get my equipment, Finch said to Davis. I need soil samples. I need to count every rosette. This is going to take weeks. Weeks, Jessica said. We can't have orange tape all over the yard for weeks. What will the neighbors think? They will think, I said, speaking for the first time in a while, that something important is happening here. I walked over to the hose. Dr. Finch, would you like some water? It's hot out. That would be great, Finch said. He smiled and his beard crinkled. I filled a glass from the pitcher I kept on the porch. I handed it to him. He drank it in one long gulp and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Jessica stood alone on the driveway. The heat radiated off the asphalt. She looked at the cool, shaded dirt where Finch stood. She looked at the house she wanted to turn into a gray box. Davis walked up to the front window of my house. He taped the red-bordered form to the glass. It faced the street. It was a warning. It was a shield. "We'll be here for a while, ma'am," Davis said to me. "Sorry for the disturbance." "No disturbance," I said. I sat on my bench and watched the orange ribbons flutter in the breeze. They looked festive. They looked like a celebration. The next week transformed my front yard into a grid. Dr. Finch returned with 2 graduate students from the university. They wore heavy boots and wide-brimmed hats. They drove wooden stakes into the ground at 1-meter intervals and tied white cotton string between them, creating dozens of perfect squares over the dirt and brush. It looked like an excavation site for dinosaur bones. I sat on the porch and watched them work. It was noisy. The students called out numbers to each other. "Quad 4, Sector B, count is 12. A young woman with a ponytail yelled. "Check for recruitment," Finch replied. He lay on his stomach on a foam mat, peering under the canopy of a lemonade berry bush. "I see seedlings." The neighbors noticed. Before, they walked their dogs quickly past my house, looking straight ahead to avoid making eye contact with the crazy plant lady. Now they stopped. Mr. Henderson walked by with his golden retriever. He stopped at the edge of the driveway, where the orange flagging tape fluttered. He watched Finch brush soil away from a root with a small paintbrush. "What are they finding, Alara?" Bill asked. He squinted against the morning sun. "Is it valuable?" "It's rare," I said. I poured a cup of coffee from the thermos I kept on the table. "Dr. Finch says this soil is millions of years old." Bill looked at his own lawn across the street. It was flat, green, and completely uniform. He looked back at my yard, at the scientists measuring leaves with digital calipers. "Huh," Bill said. "I thought it was just dry brush." "Most people do," I said. "Mark came by on Wednesday. He parked his car on the street because the driveway was full of Finch's equipment crates. He walked up the path, stepping carefully over the white strings. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened and his top button was undone. "Jessica is losing her mind," Mark said. He didn't say hello. He just collapsed onto the bench beside me. "Is she?" I asked. I handed him a bottle of water. "She called the city manager. She called the mayor's office," Mark said. He rubbed his face with both hands. The sound of his palms against his stubble was rough. They all told her the same thing. Federal law trumps city code. As long as that study is happening, we can't touch a single pebble. "Good," I said. Mark looked at the red-bordered stop-work order still taped to the front window. The sun had started to fade the red ink to a dull pink. "She's embarrassed, Mom," Mark said quietly. "She told everyone at the club she was renovating. She showed them the plans for the concrete courtyard. Now she has to explain why there are people with clipboards crawling all over the property." "She wanted attention," I said. I pointed to the yard. "Now she has it." Dr. Finch stood up and walked over to us. He held a clipboard. He looked dirty and happy. There was a smudge of clay on his nose. "Alara," Finch said. "I have some preliminary data." Mark sat up straighter. "Is it over? Can we remove the weeds now?" Finch looked at Mark. He didn't blink. "These plants are not weeds. They are ancestors." Finch turned the clipboard around so we could see. It was a map of my yard drawn in black ink. Hundreds of small green dots covered the paper. "This population is dense," Finch explained. He tapped the paper with his dirty finger. "And it's old. Based on the root crown size of the larger shrubs, I estimate this habitat has been intact for at least 80 years. Maybe more. It survived the construction of this subdivision." He looked at me. "You didn't just preserve it, Alara. You let it recover. If you had watered this like a lawn, the roots would have rotted in a month. If you had fertilized it, the invasive grasses would have choked them out. You did exactly the right thing by doing nothing." I felt a lump in my throat. For years Jessica told me I was lazy. She told me I was letting the house go. She told me I was giving up. Doing nothing is hard work, I said. Finch nodded. It is. He turned to Mark. I'm filing the report with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service tomorrow. Once that happens, the designation becomes permanent. This site will be registered. Mark looked at the map. He looked at the dots. Permanent? You mean forever? As long as the law stands, Finch said. You can't build an addition. You can't put in a pool. You can't pave the driveway wider. Mark let out a long breath. He looked at the concrete brochure that was still lying on the ground under the bench, collecting dust. Jessica is going to scream, Mark said. Let her scream, I said. That afternoon, the students packed up their equipment. They rolled up the white string and pulled the wooden stakes out of the ground. The yard looked the same as it always did, brown, gray, and green, but now I saw it differently. I didn't just see bushes. I saw a map. I saw a history that went down deep into the earth, below the foundation of the house, below the streets. I walked out to the mailbox. A woman from down the street, someone I didn't know, was walking past with a stroller. She stopped. Excuse me, she said. She pointed to the yard. Is this the place with the rare flowers? I saw it on the neighborhood app. Someone posted a picture of the scientists. Yes, I said. This is the place. That's really cool, she said. She smiled. I always wondered why you didn't have grass. It makes sense now. She pushed the stroller away. I stood there and listened to the silence of the garden. It wasn't empty silence. It was the silence of a library or a museum. It was the silence of something valuable. I went back to the porch and picked up the brochure for the concrete paving. I crumpled it into a ball. The paper was stiff and glossy. It made a sharp cracking sound. I dropped it into the recycling bin. 2 weeks later, a heavy parcel arrived. The delivery driver had to use 2 hands to carry it up the driveway. He set it down on the porch table with a dull thud. Sign here, please, he said, holding out a digital pad. I scribbled my name. I waited until his truck rumbled away before I opened the box. I used a kitchen knife to slice through the thick packing tape. Inside, nestled in styrofoam peanuts, was a rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. I pulled it out. It was heavy and cold. I tore the paper away. It was a plaque. It was made of cast bronze, the letters raised and polished against a dark textured background. It read, Certified Critical Habitat Site. Protected by the State of California Conservation Act. Do not disturb. At the bottom there was a smaller line of text. Steward, Alara Vance. I ran my thumb over the raised letters of my name. The metal felt solid and permanent. A car door slammed in the street. I looked up. Jessica walked up the driveway. She did not walk with her usual fast, clicking stride. She walked slowly. Her shoulders were slumped. Mark followed close behind her, carrying a file folder. They stopped at the porch steps. Jessica looked at the bronze plaque in my hands. Her eyes narrowed. So, she said. It's official. Yes, I said. It arrived today. Do you know what you've done? Jessica asked. Her voice was not loud, but it shook. Do you have any idea what this does to the estate? I haven't done anything to the estate, I said. I just live here. You devalued it, Jessica said. She pointed at the house, at the land. Mark, show her. Mark opened the file folder. He pulled out a sheet of paper with columns of numbers. He placed it on the table next to the bronze plaque. Mom, Mark said gently, we spoke to a real estate appraiser. Because of the habitat designation, the land can never be subdivided. It can never be expanded. A developer can't buy this lot to build 2 modern homes on it, which is what everyone is doing in this neighborhood. That was the plan, Jessica interrupted. She stared at me. That was the retirement plan. The land was worth $2 million as a development site. Now, as a single-family home with a protected yard that you can't even weed whack? It's worth half that. I looked at the numbers. I saw the estimated sale price. It was lower. I don't plan on selling it, I said. But Jessica started then stopped. She bit her lip. Eventually, Alara, this house passes to us. To Mark. And you just wiped out $1 million of inheritance because you wanted to keep some bushes. I kept the history, I said. And I kept my home. I reached into the box and pulled out another envelope that had come with the plaque. I opened it. It was a letter from the county assessor's office. You should look at this too, I said. I handed the letter to Mark. Mark adjusted his glasses. He read the letter silently. His eyebrows went up. He read it again. What is it? Jessica snapped. Another fine? No, Mark said. He looked up at me, then at Jessica. It's a tax reassessment. Because the land is now under a conservation easement, the property taxes are reduced by 90%. Jessica froze. What? Mom was paying $12,000 a year in property taxes, Mark said. Now she pays $1,200. Effective immediately. I took a sip of my iced tea. The condensation from the glass dripped onto the table. I live on a fixed income, Jessica. That savings means I don't have to worry about bills. It means I can afford to stay here comfortably for the rest of my life. Jessica looked at the letter in Mark's hand. She looked at the bronze plaque. Her face flushed a deep pink. She opened her mouth to argue, but there was no argument to make. The money she wanted from the sale was theoretical, years away. The money I saved on taxes was real, and it started today. You did this on purpose, Jessica whispered. You knew. I knew I wanted to stay in my home, I said. I knew I didn't want concrete. Jessica turned around. She looked at the garden. The afternoon light hit the Madeleine poppies, making their white petals shine like paper lanterns. A scrub jay landed on the fence and screeched loudly. She realized she had no power here anymore. The city inspector worked for me now. The federal government worked for me. The dirt itself had more legal standing than her opinion. Come on, Mark, Jessica said. Her voice was tight and small. Let's go. I'm going to stay for a bit, Mark said. He sat down on the bench. I haven't had iced tea in a while. Jessica looked at him. She looked at me. She turned and walked back to the car alone. Her heels didn't click as loudly on the way out. The engine started and she drove away fast, tires squealing slightly on the asphalt. Mark sighed. He loosened his tie. He picked up the bronze plaque. This is heavy. It is, I said. Where are you going to put it? He asked. On the big rock by the sidewalk, I said. So everyone can see it. Mark looked out at the yard. He looked at the orange flags that still fluttered in the breeze, marking the boundaries of the protected zone. It's quiet here, he said. It is, I said. It's peaceful. I picked up the letter from the tax assessor. I folded it neatly and put it in my pocket. The paper felt crisp. I looked at the garden. The plants were not just surviving anymore. They were paying their rent. On Saturday morning, Mark came over with a masonry drill. He wore work clothes, old jeans and a t-shirt that had a small paint stain on the hem. He didn't bring Jessica. We stood by the large sandstone boulder near the sidewalk. It was the anchor of the front garden, a heavy, rough rock that I had refused to move 30 years ago. Now it was going to be a pedestal. Where do you want it? Mark asked. He held the heavy bronze plaque against the stone surface. Lower, I said. Eye level for a child. Mark adjusted the metal plate. He took a yellow pencil from behind his ear and marked the holes on the rock. The sound of the drill biting into the stone was loud and grinding. Dust puffed up into the air, smelling like crushed flint. I watched him work. A month ago, he wanted to pave this rock over. Now, he was sweating to make sure the sign that protected it was perfectly level. Cars slowed down as they passed. They didn't slow down to gawk or shake their heads anymore. They slowed down to read. Bill Henderson walked across the street. He didn't bring a petition this time. He held a red plastic watering can. Morning, Ilara, Bill said. He nodded at Mark. Putting up the official seal? That's right, I said. Bill looked at the patch of Dudleya Veritii inside the orange flags, which we had replaced with a tasteful low rope fence. I looked those up online. The white ones. They really are rare. I didn't know we had things like that in the neighborhood. We have a lot of things we don't notice, I said. My grandkids are coming next week, Bill said. He shifted the watering can. I was wondering if you wouldn't mind showing them? They're learning about ecosystems in school. I think they'd get a kick out of seeing $1 million weed. I smiled. I would love to show them. Mark turned off the drill. The silence rushed back into the yard, filled only by the sound of wind in the Torrey pine. He blew the dust out of the holes and squeezed a tube of construction adhesive onto the back of the plaque. He pressed the bronze plate against the rock. He held it there, his muscles tense, waiting for the glue to grip. "There," Mark said. He stepped back. The sun hit the metal. The bronze shone warmly against the gray stone. Certified critical habitat site. It looked official. It looked like it belonged in a state park, not on a suburban street corner. "It looks good," Mark said. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Jessica saw the new tax bill yesterday." "Did she?" I asked. Mark nodded. He looked at the ground. "She stopped looking at concrete brochures. She bought a bird feeder for our backyard." "It's a start." "It is," I said. Later that afternoon I sat on the bench. The sun was beginning to dip low, casting the long golden light of the magic hour across the garden. This was the time of day when the native plants looked their best. The dry leaves glowed, and the shadows gave the yard depth and mystery. I held a cup of tea. The ceramic was warm in my hands. A small movement caught my eye near the protected patch. A butterfly, small and blue, fluttered erratically over the white succulents. It was a Palos Verdes blue, or maybe just a common hair streak. I wasn't sure. But it landed on the chalky leaves of the Dudleya. It opened its wings, absorbing the heat. I took a deep breath. The air smelled of sage and cooling earth. My in-laws wanted a generic slate of gray. They wanted to erase the wrinkles of the earth to make it look new and expensive. They thought value came from what you could buy at a hardware store. I looked at the bronze plaque. I looked at the small, fragile plant that had stopped a bulldozer. I didn't have a perfect green lawn. I had dust. I had rocks. I had dried sticks that looked dead until the rain came. But I also had a sanctuary. I had a legacy that would outlive me, and certainly outlive the concrete driveways of my neighbors. I took a sip of tea. It was strong and sweet. I watched the butterfly lift off and fly toward the manzanita. I stayed on the bench until the sun went down and the streetlights flickered on, buzzing softly in the twilight. I wasn't just an old woman in a messy yard anymore. I was the keeper of the treasure. And that was the best revenge of all.